Hello and welcome to another edition of Employ to Innovate for the month of October. And with me, I am joined by Dennis Vincencio, which you should be familiar with by now. And we've got an actually pretty interesting conversation, discussion to go through. But Dennis, say hello, introduce yourself, and then we'll kind of dive into the discussion.
Thanks, Jen, for that great introduction. As everybody may or may not know, my name is Dennis Vicencio. I am a business coach. I have experience in managerial accounting and have been a CFO and a controller for small and medium-sized businesses most of my career. So this is a topic that Jen's brought up that is near and dear to my heart. So I'm excited about talking about it.
And what the topic is on that little mysterious thing is the two essentials for company culture. And as you know, with everything that has happened with COVID, company culture is a key deciding factor for when employees want to decide, do they come back to work? Do they jump ship? Do they do something different? One of those deciding factors we know to be company culture. And there's two essential things. There's more, of course, but we've picked two essential things to really, tear apart and discuss on how they can help foster a really positive and encouraging company culture that actually attracts rather than detract from employees wanting to stay with the company and contributing to that company in very positive ways. So Dennis, what are your thoughts on company culture as a whole? And then we'll kind of get into the first essential and discuss that.
Sure. Jenna, I especially as spending a lot of time in small businesses and in medium-sized businesses, what's interesting to me is that there's a lot of talk as a business grows about branding. Like, what does the company mean? And when we talk about branding, we talk about branding to what our customer sees, right? But when we talk about company culture, that kind of gets lost a little bit as how do our employees perceive us, right? So one of the things I always think about is that do those two things match up, right? Is how we look to our how we want to look to our clients, is that being supported by our employees? Because our employees are probably one of the most important pieces when it comes to our exposure to our clients. Wouldn't you agree, Jen?
I absolutely agree. And quite frankly, I think culture is a top down type of push. But what essentially happens, depending on how many layers you've got to go down, sometimes it gets whitewashed at the lower levels of the organization, or it gets misstated, or it gets become really something vague. It's hard to hang your hat on as an employee on what the culture is, right? Or how should I perceive this? What are our values? What are the things that we hold dear? And then once in a while you get those lower managers, right, or supervisors that then taint it by going against what you believe the culture to be, or what you understood when you were oriented to the company. So I think there's an element of consistency and message, not only with your branding, but just internally as hierarchical layers get embedded in the company as it grows. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, especially when you have a founder or an owner that starts something from something very small and a very tight-knit group. So, in businesses that I've been involved in that are, there's maybe 3 or 5 of us that start a business where the culture kind of develops because everybody has such a daily interaction, not only with customers at that level, but with other employees. There isn't so much separation, but as you said, hierarchically speaking, as the company grows, the layers get put in. And the one thing I think, and big businesses, I think, do a good job of understanding that when you have all these layers in here, if you're not awfully careful about how you develop a brand or a culture, an employee culture, that it can get away from you very quickly, right?
Exactly.
So
exactly.
I think that's one of the things that the small business owner and the medium-sized business owner has to recognize, to your point, is that a lot of times those people that are lower in the structure are actually they're also the ones that sometimes are the most customer facing people, right?
Mhm.
So if they don't understand the culture or they don't have a good perception of the culture,
Mhm.
how can they present the brand or how can they present who the company is or wants to be? It's a very delicate balancing act, I think. And I think that's one of the things that how you address it and top down is a very interesting thought about that. Um, but I think we need to kind of delve into that a little deeper.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. I don't think it's top down in isolation. I think there should be an embracing of the employees for them to help contribute to what they think the company culture should be. And I think many companies, especially the small and medium sized businesses now, are dealing with new entrants into the workforce that have a very different ideology on what they're prepared to put up with. And many times the old world thinking of what corporate or business is will not sit with these younger individuals. They want flexibility. They want autonomy. There's many things that they want that are very different um, from prior. I think the prior generations kind of folded into a company and adjusted themselves for the company. The the younger workers are not adjusting themselves for a company. They're not prepared to do that. So companies have a lot to think about and make culture a very core focus of what they do. It can't be an afterthought. It can't be a sidebar thing they do. There's got to be a focus, which goes back to what you originally said about branding. And the same effort and time and thought they put into their brand is the same effort, time, and thought they need to put into their culture and make sure those two align, right?
Right,
And by
right,
aligning those two, you align the efforts and it becomes more, cost effective, time effective, and company effective
right.
to deliver.
And I think, and we've had it in previous discussions, is that one of the benefits of a small and medium sized businesses compared to a larger corporate entities is that we talked about in Employ to Innovate before about smaller businesses can be more nimble. You can change something relatively quickly. A
Mhm.
big 1,000-person organization, some of these things cannot change. It's hard to test some of these ideas out. So I think that one of the things that I think about especially when we talk about culture and what maybe some of the younger generation is kind of looking for is um, really, I have two thoughts on that. One is they tend to communicate digitally.
Mhm.
Okay. And unless you understand that digital communication as a leader within an organization, you have to understand that that is probably a very much preferred methodology of communication.
Mhm.
Now, again, going back to some other topics that we've talked about, if arguably said, more than 50% or more than 70% of all communication is nonverbal, digitally things can get lost in translation. So part of the leadership is understanding, especially with new employees, when you communicate digitally, we have to be a little bit more clear and concise about what we're really trying to convey, right?
Right.
So whether we're typing it in a text, whether we're communicating with another employee in a text, whether we're posting something on a social media platform, whether we are emailing a client or a customer, all those things have a different uh, perception based on not only you only have the words as opposed to
Mhm.
my expression or as opposed to my posture, all the things that come out of this, right? So digital communication is one side of it for the small business and medium-sized business owner. I think the other one is that establishing what I feel is a base of open communication with my employees, right? So that to me, I think is foundationally um, you have to communicate not on a regular, let's say, schedule of when is my review going to happen or do we have our weekly meetings? I think
Mhm.
open communication means that that's how you're nimble, right? I think that's one of the things that makes a small business nimble, is that we can have conversations about what's happening either within the employee organization or within the brand itself, and be able to react to that much quicker. That's that. Those
And
are kind of
I think you raise a very good point, and I know you and I strongly believe that small and medium sized businesses are in the best time of their life right now
right.
to compete with big businesses. It really has turned around, that it is a vibrant environment right now for small and medium sized businesses to really take hold and make an impact with young workers and embrace young workers, because they do have that nimble ability to move and adjust and to focus on the things that are important and to embrace the technology and digital technology in a massive way. So we I know you and I believe that the small businesses can compete in a way they probably couldn't 10 years ago. And they really have to look at that very closely, and not buy into that, oh, COVID hit us, and but to look for those creative, innovative ways to really put their business forward in a very strong way and compete with the big businesses. Now, with that said, let's get into some of what those two essential things are. The first one being, we didn't reveal it in our pre-promos, and we didn't reveal, so we're going to reveal it now,
Right.
is ideology. Um, I've written articles about this and the importance of encouraging ideology throughout the organization. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I think, and I look at this topic especially, is as a leader of a small business or a medium-sized business, you are, like you said, you set the tone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of this environment that we're talking about is we're trying to encourage a very accepting environment, right? And that's one of the big, I think, overarching is what a lot of people are talking about, and we get kind of caught up a lot in those terms and words. But I think what we're really talking about, again, I think it's some old school thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
So are we communicating? How are we communicating, especially with our employees? Like what is our method of communication? What is our culture? Like what does our business want to be looking out to the customers? What does our
Mm-hmm.
business want to be looking to our employees? You got to have some of that stuff that's kind of, I always like to say with businesses I work with, defined and written down, right? So if you don't define it and write it down, it's very hard. You can talk about it, but it can get kind of confusing. People like to see things written. It goes back to the digital communication. So I can tell you a million different ways that I am, as a business leader, I'm open to suggestions, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm open to people's ideas. I'm open to maybe other cultures that I didn't grow up in, or I want my business to grow. In practice, those things can be a little bit more difficult because we all bring a certain
Mm-hmm.
amount, and we've talked about this in other Employed Innovate topics. Bias was one I think that we talked about a few months ago. So I think you've got to kind of set a tone. Who are you, right? And what do you want the business to be, so that everybody kind of understands the foundational ground rules, I guess, would be
Mm-hmm.
my thought. And from there, I think about terms that I've heard over the course of my, almost 40-year career now, about like transparency, right? So is there transparency in hiring?
Mm-hmm.
Is there transparency in compensation? Is there transparency in benefit packages? A lot of that stuff in small businesses, I think that's where they really, I want to say, trip up. You know what I mean? Because there is not a lot of conversation about, like, because the owner sometimes is involved in a lot of these negotiations right at the top. There just seems to be this level of secrecy. And the example that I'll use is a company that started very close to here It was called Ben and Jerry's, and they made ice cream.
All right.
And when I was in college, way back when, there was two kind of let's say alternative lifestyle. They were hippies, two guys, Ben and Jerry, and they traveled around and sold premium ice cream, which was not unusual at that period of time.
Right.
But they were passionate about it. They're very passionate about the ice cream business. But one of the things as their company grew, and I was in my career, I was actually got to meet one of the original 7 employees of Ben and Jerry's. And she actually was a HR manager at a medium-sized business that I worked for. And she had a lot of conversations about Ben and Jerry's starting out with 2 guys making ice cream, by having a truck and driving around selling it, to hiring 7 employees that they all were very close and very good friends, and they all spread out trying to spread the word about Ben and Jerry's, to a very large corporation, and the struggles that happened within that. But one of the things that Ben and Jerry's said early on is that as the owner, they were one of the first companies that they published everybody's salary. It was posted. What everybody made, their name, what they made. And both Ben and Jerry agreed that they would never make, I think it was when they started, I want to say it was 2.5 times what the lowest paid employee was going to make. And we've seen this over the course of the years, attempted in a lot of ways. And I think back to businesses I work with, and if you do it right, and it's a hard thing to do, but if you do it right, it takes a lot of that conversation on the back end of it about, like, well, what does this person make? What does that person make? So I think that's one of the things that it's an idea, right? So it's an idea about a culture of how you want the company to run. And they ran with it for a long period of time. They actually had to raise that number in order to hire people as they got bigger. They had to raise that number up, but it stayed with the company for a very long period of time, I think, until they were bought by whatever the national conglomerate is that owns them now. But that was an idea about how it works in practice, right? So those are one of the things that I kind of think about. So.
But the other aspect of ideology, and I commend Ben and Jerry for that kind of thought, but I also think, as you were saying it, that came from them, right? And I wonder, when we talk about ideas, say something like that came to them from an employee, would it have been received and implemented in the same way because it came from them? You see what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
So one aspect of ideology for me is about the willingness of the organization to embrace employees' thoughts, no matter the rank, right? No matter where they place, and be able to explore, not necessarily accept it, but at least explore it and see where it places in line with the company. I think when it comes to ideology, a lot of employees, when you talk to the individual employees, do not feel comfortable bringing their ideas and their thoughts upward. And for me, when we talk about ideology as part of a company culture, it is about fostering the comfort level of employees to know that no matter how far-fetched the idea, no matter how ridiculous it might sound, you are embraced to bring it forward in some way, in your town halls, in a written something you write and drop in a box, and it's not just going to be thrown away. It's actually going to be looked at and thought about. Your idea could become refined, where let's say now somebody drops it in a box, they look through all those ideas and they go, you know what? They're onto something. It ain't perfect.
Right.
But they're onto something, and bring it to a town hall to then say, this idea came in as this and it transitioned to this, and now it's going to be implemented as this. But it actually originated here with employee X. That to me is true embracing of ideology within a corporate culture. Yeah. And how do a company does that? I know I was talking a lot, but I had a lot of thoughts.
So I think you bring up some points in terms of what can a small business and or medium-sized business do to, and I think that's a good starting point. I think it opens up that what I'm trying to get to is that open level of communication where I do feel comfortable bringing an idea up. Um, and in a lot of cases, I've seen companies do it with like a reward system, you know, and at least in some groups, you know, that I've been involved in different management structures, I've seen this technique used a lot in brainstorming when you're trying to solve a problem that has been very unsolvable at some cases. Like, what are we going to do to solve the problem? Out of the box thinking. There's a lot of terms that we use to this, but I think what we're really talking about is that, can I get in a meeting and say something, or can I meet with my supervisor and say something and not have it be perceived as something else? And I think what I'm trying to say is that a lot of that, you know, there's a lot of experience that happens with that sometimes, and goes back to the other thing, is that a new employee needs to be given somewhat of a pathway, you know, and I'm not saying constraining them, but, you know, how do you get them to embrace that? And how do you get a hierarchical, let's use the term supervisor because it's easy to use, but how do you get that? How do you educate a supervisor who doesn't have that experience of that kind of management structure from any previous places they worked at? You're gonna bring this to the table. What I'm really trying to say is that it's something that you want to be thoughtful about. It's not something that you just want to say, okay, we're going to put up a suggestion box. Everybody throw something in there and we'll read them out every meeting. So I think there's got to be
strategy. I think
it's got to be part of a bigger strategy.
It's a strategic commitment to encourage ideology in the organization, and how you go about it. I agree with you, has to be well thought out. In the articles that I wrote, I talked about 3 tiers: having, you know, your ideology flow into your vision, flow into your strategy, and then flow back into your execution. In terms of how you structure your organization to embrace that. And there's a number of different ways you can structure. I'm not saying mine is the only way, but that is certainly one way I've talked about and written about how you do it. I think the key part is the embracing that it can occur, and strategically ensuring that it can occur, and that employees are comfortable in doing that. And that starts, and you're comfortable with this, with the whole onboarding. When you onboard the employees, you bring them into the cultural values and systems and things that you hold dear, of which ideology, in my mind, is an essential key part of some of those values. And you very rarely see it.
So, right. And I think there's that, how do you start? Right. Yeah. But then there's also this maintenance component that we can talk about. And I see this happen a lot in businesses where the onboarding process, sometimes it hits the nail on the head. Like, the handbook is written very well. There is a mission statement that's part of the handbook. It all looks good. But then when you get into the day-to-day practice, you start to drift, right? Mm-hmm. So there seems to be this like, how do I make it all? How do I tie this stuff together? And it's got to evolve like a living organism, right? So in my mind, all those things you talk about you need to have that, you need to set it. But if you're not focused on what does that mean to that new employee that just came in yesterday and wants to be a good employee, how often are you really touching base with that new employee? You know, like what is your structure to find out? If I'm the general manager of a 50-person organization, do I know everybody's name? Have I made it a point as the general manager to, do my daily, meet and greet with all the employees, so that I would, what we used to suggest to a lot of managers is that, at 9 o'clock, you're grabbing your cup of coffee or your beverage and you walk around and you're talking to everybody on the floor as they're working, right? So whatever your business structure is that's an important piece, that they see you as more than just that person behind the big door or the one that's always buried because they're, on the phone, that becomes an important part of your culture, so that you can start seeing,
Mm-hmm.
is this being implemented, and do I need to modify and change it? So I think that's part of good management, right?
Right.
So I think you got to dovetail those, um, the bigger vision structures things to teach managers, whether at different layers, how to make it work. And I think those
Right.
two things got to work hand in hand, because if you don't maintain it, it'll drift away. Like it can, if it's printed in a book and that's the last time that they see it. And I mean, I've seen it before, is like, it's printed on the wall. It's a sign that sits, somewhere prominent within a business, but practically speaking, it's about the interaction. In my mind, it's about, to your point,
Mm-hmm.
does that new employee who sees something feel comfortable about bringing up a idea to, how does that happen, and how is it received?
And I think it's also about the circular movement of employees as well. So
Mhm.
if you're in a production planning, and I know you know this in the manufacturing, for example, and you have different stations, when you were learning on the job, what they would do is they would start you in station A, and then eventually they move you to station B. And I know Amazon does this with their, with their distribution centers. And they start you in station A, they move you to station B, they move you to station C. And what actually ends up happening in that movement is that when you say get to station B, something you knew in station A that didn't work, you see why it doesn't work in station B, and you're
Right.
like, why are we not doing this and that? Because you can now connect the dots. And a
Right.
lot of times ideology is fostered through those types of circulation, circular movements of employees.
Yeah.
But when you get into that specialist mode, now think now corporate, right?
Mhm.
Where you bring in someone and they're an IT specialist, and they sit and they do an IT specialist, but they don't do the support, or they can't see the connection of the dots. And so their ideology can only come out in that very, restricted area that they see every day. But then they get accustomed to what's going on, and it needs a new person coming in to say, why are we doing it that way?
So this is so interesting in terms of when you talk about this coming full circle, about bringing all these pieces together. And I've experienced this in manufacturing just like you have, is that is a strategy that, you get to see all the pieces before you land on one, let's say, per se, that you're going to be the person. And then especially if you're in a job that has a lot of repetitive movement, sometimes you move people because, you don't want them to have repetitive movement injuries,
Right.
and all that other stuff. But one of the things when we talk about culture, and you just kind of piqued some interest with me, is that, go back to, let's say, at least my parents or my grandparents' generation, as they came up through business. And one of the changes I think that's happened here is that, when my grandfather got hired as an 18-year-old coming out of high school, when he went to work for a company, he probably thought that he was going to retire with that particular company.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings up some other questions about, like, how did they encourage that kind of loyalty, right?
Right.
And have that long lasting employment. But one of the things that used to happen in that time is that the company that you worked for was also your social circle, right?
Yes,
So,
yes.
right. So you had employees that, the employees that you worked with were also the same people that, you maybe went to picnics with on Saturday. Sometimes the company would put on a regular social event.
Absolutely.
Maybe after work, everybody would get together and go to the same watering hole, and there'd be conversations, some good, some not so good. But at the end of the day, it was more of a sense of community.
Yes.
So,
agreed. I grew up that way.
right. And I grew up in that kind of atmosphere.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes that gets away from you, as my grandfather at 53 years old, I think, showed up for work one day, and the doors to the factory that he worked with were padlocked. Now, that's the other side of that piece of the puzzle. But at the end of the day, when I think about the small business owner, one of the things that we had talked about in a previous Employee to Innovate was the cost of acquiring a new employee. So the longer that you can keep them in play is really cost effective to you. And I think it falls back to this concept of an ideologically encouraging culture that you can be flexible and move, because employees' lives are going to change over the course of times. And you don't, like to your point when you started out with, is that my grandfather understood maybe that he wanted to fit in with this particular business for whatever reason, and this was something that he liked and found out that he was good at, and then as long as he was treated fairly, he was going to stay there. But I think that there's what we're seeing for a lot of various reasons is that you're seeing more movement than we did in his area. How do you address that? And I think one of the things that we talk about is, it all flows back to this open level of communication between an employee and an employer and a customer, because we have this triangle, right? That we all have to understand that I can't live without you too. If I'm the leader, unless I can handle all the transactions, deal with all the customers, I am going to limit my growth to just me. Right. So I've got to have employees, and I have to have customers, and this triangle has to exist.
It has to exist. And the owner does not know it all.
And the owner, right.
Owner does not know it all.
To be
I'm
frank,
sorry, owners out there, you do not know it all.
Yeah. So I think if you think about, and I'll give you one more example. I saw this business coach talk at a large industry event one time, and he was coaching the W resorts. Okay, so the Winds, the big expensive hotels, and one of the programs that he brought in that happened is that any employee in the company, didn't matter who they were authorized to spend up to $200 per guest to satisfy any need that any of that guest had while they were there. Yeah. So that empowerment to take somebody and say, you don't have to ask for permission. Right. You just have to bring the receipt in. There'll be no questions asked. That you bring it in and you say, this, you had this, and you had to tell what happened. And the example that I used was that there was in one of the hotels, and I can't remember if it was Vegas or Hawaii or whatever it was, is that this family came in, and the youngest girl was lactose intolerant, and they were at the resort, and somebody in housekeeping was talking to somebody. So this encouraged conversations between somebody in housekeeping and the guest. They always made sure they said hi. It was part of their culture. Asking the little girl how'd she like the dessert buffet, and she said, I can't eat anything in the buffet because the mother had said this. And that night, when the housekeeping woman went home, she went to the store and bought lactose free or ice cream, and made sure that guest had that available to them, so that she didn't feel left out. Right. So those are kind of the things that, the powerfulness of that statement about how that guest felt about going to that very probably expensive resort, that somebody at that level would take that extra step to do something, right? So to me, that's really something very simple, very powerful. It encourages a lot of interaction. So there are techniques out there that you can do this that on the surface be like, well, I can't afford to do that. Well, maybe you can't afford $200, but I bet you could afford, $30,
$50, exactly.
$50.
And
You
it
know what I
leaves
mean? Like,
lasting, and the lasting memory of that, and probably the repeat bookings
right.
by that family is unprecedented. So,
Yep.
okay, so that's ideology. We've beaten that to the thing. Let's go on to, and just to restate, ideology is the first essential thing that you must, it's one of those not to be missed fundamentals of
Right.
your company culture. The second not to be missed fundamental is employee career self-management. And this is huge. I have a lot of thoughts on this.
Yeah. So,
Especially coming from banking, where people sat in banking and wanted the company to guide their careers as opposed to manage their careers. But what
right.
are your thoughts on this?
So I'm gonna touch a little bit about just where I think um, the small, and we're going to focus on small and medium sized businesses. But
Yes,
I think
absolutely.
if you don't understand um, that it, and again, I think I look at this more of, if you're not thinking about an employee, about what their career within your organization looks like, do you have, and it gets hard the smaller the company, but everybody can have, like, how do I move from one position to another? In a lot of cases, um, sometimes the clarity you can give to somebody is how can they be you? Like, if you are an entrepreneur, one of the greatest gifts you can give to an employee that works for you is how, if they have the entrepreneurial spirit, what is your experience? Well, like, what is your experience of being an entrepreneur? So I think there's a lot of educating that you can do, even the small business in it. But having that conversation about, well, what are the expectations of the employee regarded to their career? And if you're not at least having that discussion very early on, everybody's left to make assumptions, either based on their previous work history, or based on their lack of previous work history, or based on their age. All the biases that we've talked about in previous things all come to be. Whereas, don't we really just want to have a conversation?
But it, and one of the things that I teach in career, and when it comes to career self-management, is that every employee should know the value they bring to the company. You shouldn't be walking into any kind of performance review and expect your boss to tell you the value you bring. You might get disappointed. And many times people are disappointed in their performance reviews because they are going in with that mindset, right? But to be able to go in, and this is just like a little small piece of career self management, but if you go in and you actually are speaking to the value that you bring, and you can substantiate it, articulate it, show it, that alone is a powerful step in career self-management. You are not relying on the company to tell you what value you bring. You know it, you can state it, and you can substantiate it. So that's a small piece in, like, what I talk to. And when I ask some employees, they don't know. And I look at them and I go, and that is not the way to go.
Right. And I agree 100%, is that you, as an employee, you have to understand your value, your self-worth, right? And then I always flip it around on the other side and say, if I'm the manager of a particular department, if I get to an employee review and I sit with an employee and there's a surprise in there, have I really done the job that I should have done as a manager, right? That if I hadn't, to all the points that we had made before, is that if I hadn't encouraged that discussion, if they don't know the things that I want that they've done well and the things that I want them to work on, which is really, in my mind, what you're thinking about performance review, is that should just be a conversation that is kind of ties together all the other things that we've talked about during the course of the year. And I myself have been not a proponent of performance reviews and in my career. And I think that they're bad, that they, in the structure as I've seen them in annual review.
Oh, I totally agree with you. You're not going to get me to say.
I think it's not, it's a crutch that is used to avoid a lot of times things that should be fixed, not in a review setting, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not a fan, okay, and I like hearing that you're not a fan.
Mm.
But on the other side of it is that performance review has to happen all the time, right? We have to set some expectations about and it goes back to me, it always goes back to this other side of it, is that where do we want to be as a company? And am I helping somebody get to where they want to be? And
Exactly.
in some cases, getting to where they want to be, my company is a stepping stone for them. Okay. But that does not mean that they are not going to be a good employee or add value to my company while they're here. As long as we all understand that their goal is not to be that 15 years from now, or excuse me, let's put it better, 5 years from now, they do not want to be a clerk in my retail store. Okay. And if I'm running my company right, that means that I understand that, and I'm asking them, well, what do you want to be? Where do you want to go? And they may say something like, I want to be a lawyer, or I want to be a doctor, or I want to own a retail store like you. Okay, well, let's help you. What can we do as a company to help you get there? If I build that kind of culture within my company, doesn't that give us that idea that, number one, the employee we are encouraging the employee to be career self-managing, right? And I have an atmosphere that allows for that kind of growth.
Exactly. And what you're hitting on actually is one of my my platform is people innovation. And in that realm of people innovation is the concept that companies not have to start looking at their employees as assets. And I think when you start looking at your employees as assets, you have a whole different approach to the interaction and dealing with them, including you start to see that performance reviews, like you and I believe, are not really, giving you bang for your buck. It's not necessarily driving loyalty. It's driving fear. It's driving anxiety, because once a year, I either walk into an office and I'm either going to be stroked, I'm either going to be stroked and slapped, or I'm going to be outright slapped.
Right.
So there's an anxiety to that. And for the employees that are in that situation, that's why I go back to the self-management of career, is to try to manage that a little bit better, where you're a bit more in control of how that conversation takes place. Notice I said conversation.
Right. Because it should be a two-way conversation. I agree 100%. So
right.
I think
to what degree can an employee manage that and get some semblance of control over how that conversation goes but the ideal setting is it doesn't exist. And instead, what you're doing is you're looking at the employee as an asset, and then you doing that asset, you understand their interests. So what do they like in the job? What don't they like in the job? What are they not getting in the job that they think they can do a one hell of a job with, but they don't not given the opportunity, right? Like those are conversations in which you can actually plan the nurturing of the employee through the organization, right?
Yep.
But a lot of times it's not done that way. They don't see it as that organic, tactical point of continuous touch points to nurture an employee along. So how does the employee manage that? How does the employee take a bit of more control in their hands to say, listen, I just I spent 6 months at night school. You didn't pay for it. I paid for it. And I learned how to do financing, blah, blah, blah. Now I'd like to apply it. I'd like to learn how to do it. Can I do 30% working in the finance department and 70% my regular job, because I think I have the cycles to do it? Like, that's a conversation.
But yeah, that's a conversation that can evolve over the course of time. Is that, and again, it's understanding. I think, like you said, is that it's a living. People change. You know what I mean? And I think that the one thing in this particular environment is that nothing is static, right? So,
Right.
I had a great mentor at one time told me, like, businesses are never the same. They're either increasing or they're decreasing, but they're never stay the same, no matter what anybody tells you. Is that it's in a constant state of change. How you manage that change is really what you bring to the table as a manager, right? So your job is to make good managers manage change, and sometimes it's easy to focus when things are good, but it's how people deal with adversity.
Right.
And that's one of the things that you can see, and teaching. A lot of people just don't know how to deal with things when it's tough. And right now, like you said, the employees have a lot of leverage that they didn't ever have before,
Right.
because there's a lot more movement than there was previously. So the employer has to be able to be more nimble. They have to understand what do they bring to the table as a company or as a culture, so that you can prove some opportunity. That, as we've talked about before, is that if you make it all about price, that what you're paying somebody, and that's the only thing they understand when they come to work from you, then that's all you're going to be able to work from, right? But there's also benefits within a company that go beyond what I'm paying somebody for a rate. And how am I talking about those things? And I think that was part of part of a discussion. But I think if I think about the overarching theme of everything we talk about, how effective are we as communicators, and how effective are we encouraging communication within our organization? So I think I look at it in those kind of two thought processes, and really, I think I just think that's the overarching theme, and I think that's what everybody really wants. You know what I mean? And regardless of where they start in the world of, whether it's a young person coming in, whether it's an older person at the end of their career coming in, or whether it's a rising star that you're trying to bring in, that difference maker that you think is going to come in and make an immediate change. That open level of communication is really one of the things that you've got to have to start out with. And it goes back to that whole culture, ideological culture, in terms of, is it just words that you're saying, or do you live it? Is it something that, can you as a small business owner really say, I am willing to listen to ideas and change as times change? And if I can't, what does that mean for me as a business owner? And I think we both are understanding is that in this particular, especially in this employment environment, and I think that's where Employ to Innovate really comes in, is that we've got to be out of the box thinkers right now. We've got to look at different ways to keep employees as productive as possible, as long as they want to be with us. And I think if we set that tone very early, it just gives you the ability, you'll get more fruit, because it'll spread throughout the organization relatively quickly. Just Absolutely. Like when things go poorly within an organization, that spreads very quickly also, right? So
yeah, but if you have loyal employees, they'll get you through those times as well, right?
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I look at, and I'm sure, Jen, you do, a lot of times when I go, especially if I'm in a store, is that I do look at the interaction between a supervisor and an employee. And again, I give you this quick example. I was in a store, and their computer system went down. Their whole POS system went down, and the store was packed full of people, and it was a bustling environment. And I watched the manager come out from behind his desk, and he had two employees that were struggling with how they were going to handle the situation. So number one, the company didn't have a disaster plan. They left it to two of the most inexperienced people to handle it. And when that manager came out, he was very short with everybody. I'm sure the stress of having the system went down was a problem, but he didn't handle his employees in the best sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
And that sat with me as a customer looking at that. And then how I viewed the store was a lot different then. And how I viewed that person, he might have be great at what he does, but at the end of the day, I can tell you that my thoughts about him as how he handles employees was not very good. So those things, those little things, even though I didn't overhear the conversation, I saw the body language and I saw how the employees reacted to what he was trying to accomplish.
Right.
You see that, you know what I mean? And I think that's one of the ones about, like, that's really says a lot. That speaks more than words sometimes.
Absolutely. And there's nothing worse than, I'm always amazed at the leaders that don't understand. If you keep saying things and you don't take action to relate it to what you said or to reinforce what you said,
correct,
and show integrity there, people pick up on it, and it turns them a certain way. You know what I mean? You after a while start to dismiss everything they say, and people need to understand those dynamics. Whether it's taking a psychology course to understand that's what happens, right? Your actions have to match your words, and your words have to match your action. So, in wrapping up, let's wrap up. What do you want the audience watching this to take away from our conversation?
The overarching thing I want everybody to get away from this conversation is that you need to communicate, and you need to have this open level of communication. And I think it's the most important thing that you can have with an organization, is that if there's really open communication, you can solve a lot of things with that. So that's my thought process behind this. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it, though, Jen.
Oh, my wrap up is is that company culture is something that has to be thought out, and it has to be strategized, and it has to be embraced to be a coherent part of what the company is all about. No different to how you said it in the beginning, tied to your brand, tied to your image, tied to what you stand for, and what you stand for with your employees standing alongside you as assets, not just expenses. So in wrapping up, that's what I want the viewers to take away, and to look and perhaps, be a steward for making it a prominent consideration within their company if they feel that it's lacking. Be honest about that, because I think sometimes you'll surprise people. A lot of times leaders walk around thinking all these things are ironed out. And when people actually speak up and say, no, it isn't, I haven't a clue what the culture of this organization is. And I don't feel like I fit into whatever it is right now. I think leaders need to hear that. It might be a difficult thing to hear and to sink in, but I do believe they need to hear it. And I think the employees have a responsibility to themselves and to their peers to be a voice for that, not disrespectfully, but respectfully stated, so that getting the attention and saying we need to address this and go from there.
Yep. I'm on board 100%.
So that is my wrap up on this conversation. I hope as you watch, you find it informative. If it is, please follow us. Please look out for us. We do an Employ to Innovate once a week. And if demand keeps up, we will turn it to twice a month. But we do it once a month, and they'll turn to twice a month. So thank you for joining us. I also want to say hello to our LinkedIn network, because this is our first time airing and streaming on LinkedIn. And I look forward to that as it expands and develops and everything. So, Dennis, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jen. I appreciate it. As always, a great conversation.
Yeah, we have such a passion for this topic and for what this show has to think. So I really do appreciate it. And I, as always, love talking to you. And on that note, we are going to say good night and have the remaining rest of your day.